There's a specific category of behavior that almost everyone misreads completely because it looks on the surface like indifference, like moving on, like someone who's genuinely stopped caring about you at all. But underneath certain very particular signs, what's actually happening is closer to the opposite. A narcissist who is still, quietly, intensely obsessed with you, using indifference itself as one more tool to maintain a connection they haven't actually let go of. Today, we're walking through exactly what those signs look like so you can stop mistaking their performance of moving on for the real thing. Let's start with something that needs to be understood clearly before any of these individual signs make sense. Obsession, for a narcissist, rarely looks the way people expect obsession to look. Most people imagine obsession as visible longing, constant contact, desperate pleas, obvious emotional displays of missing someone. And sometimes it does look like that, especially early on. But once a narcissist realizes that visible longing isn't working, isn't generating the reaction they want, the obsession doesn't disappear. It simply changes shape, often into something that looks, from the outside, almost indistinguishable from actually letting go. This is exactly why so many people conclude a narcissist has moved on, precisely at the moment when the obsession has actually just gone underground, continuing to operate through channels that are much harder to recognize. Let's go through the specific signs, because once you see them laid out together, a pattern becomes unmistakable that's very easy to miss when you're only looking at one incident at a time. The first sign: they consistently know things about your life they shouldn't have any obvious way of knowing. This is one of the clearest, most concrete indicators, and it's remarkable how often people dismiss it as coincidence rather than recognizing it for what it actually is. If someone comments on a recent post you made on an account they claim not to follow, references a job change or a move they weren't told about directly, or somehow always seems to know exactly when something significant is happening in your life, despite supposedly having no contact with you at all, this isn't coincidence. This is monitoring, active and ongoing, regardless of whatever indifferent front is being maintained in your direct interactions. Genuine indifference doesn't come paired with detailed current knowledge of someone's life. That combination only exists when someone is actively watching closely, consistently, precisely because they haven't actually stopped caring at all. The second sign: mutual friends report unprompted questions about you, delivered with a studied casualness that doesn't quite land as casual. How's she doing? Dropped into an unrelated conversation. Does he still work at that same place? Asked with a tone that's trying hard to sound like idle curiosity, but carries an unmistakable weight underneath it. This behavior reveals something important. A person who's genuinely moved on doesn't need ongoing updates about your life, delivered secondhand, through people who have to carefully report back what was asked and how it was asked. The very existence of these questions, especially when they arrive persistently over months or years rather than fading naturally the way genuine indifference would produce, is a direct signal that you're still occupying real space in their attention, regardless of whatever they've told you or anyone else directly about being over it. The third sign: they show up with suspicious frequency in spaces where they know there's a reasonable chance of encountering you, while maintaining plausible deniability about the reason. The same coffee shop you used to frequent together, now visited with unusual regularity by someone who supposedly moved on entirely. The same friend group's events attended despite a previously established pattern of avoiding those exact gatherings. A sudden, renewed interest in a hobby or activity that happens to overlap significantly with spaces you're known to occupy. This kind of engineered proximity is deliberate, even when it's dressed up as coincidence, because genuine indifference doesn't require careful positioning near someone you claim not to care about anymore. It requires the opposite: my actual avoidance, which is what people who've genuinely moved on tend to do naturally, without needing to think about it at all. The fourth sign, and one of the more emotionally confusing ones to witness: an intensified, almost theatrical display of how well they're supposedly doing, specifically visible in spaces where they know you're likely to see it, This might look like an unusually curated social media presence that ramps up precisely around milestones you'd know about from the relationship, an anniversary of when you met, a birthday, a holiday you used to spend together, timed with suspicious precision to coincide with moments you're statistically most likely to be thinking about them too. Genuine indifference doesn't require performance for an audience of one specific person. This kind of display is calibrated specifically for your eyes, even when it's technically visible to everyone, because the entire point is ensuring that whatever you see convinces you they're thriving without you, which only actually matters to someone who still deeply cares what you think about how they're doing. The fifth sign: an inability to let a mutual conflict, disagreement, or misunderstanding actually rest, even long after any practical reason for revisiting it has passed. This shows up as bringing up old grievances unprompted, months or years after they supposedly stopped mattering, or reaching out with a clarification about something that happened long ago that nobody but them was still thinking about. Genuine emotional distance allows old conflicts to actually fade into the past, becoming irrelevant simply through the passage of time and the redirection of attention elsewhere. A narcissist, still genuinely obsessed with maintaining some form of connection to you, often can't let these threads go, because every unresolved thread functions as a legitimate sounding reason to reach back into contact, revisiting an old wound not because it still matters practically, but because it provides an excuse to reestablish a connection that direct, honest communication about missing you would never allow them to admit to wanting in the first place. Here's what ties all five of these signs together, and it's the actual thesis of this entire episode: obsession that can't express itself directly, because directness would require an admission of ongoing need that runs against how a narcissist has learned to present themselves, doesn't simply disappear. It gets rerouted into indirect channels: monitoring, secondhand questions, engineered proximity, performative displays, and unresolved threads, all of which allow the underlying need for continued connection to be satisfied without ever requiring the vulnerability of stating it honestly. This explains something that confuses a lot of people who've experienced this dynamic firsthand: the specific, almost eerie sense that someone who claims to have moved on entirely is still, somehow, deeply aware of your life in ways that don't add up with genuine indifference. That sense isn't paranoia. It's an accurate read on a real pattern, one that's specifically designed to be deniable, precisely so that if you ever did call it out directly, they could dismiss it as coincidence, as you reading too much into things, as evidence that you're the one who's still hung up on them, rather than the reverse. I want to say something important here because this entire topic can easily be misread as flattering, as evidence that you're so significant, so unforgettable, that even a narcissist can't fully let you go. That framing feels good in a strange way, but it misses the actual point of understanding this pattern, which is not to feel validated by their ongoing attention, but to recognize it accurately so you don't mistake it for something it isn't: genuine remorse, genuine growth, genuine readiness to build something healthier than what existed before. Obsession, even disguised as indifference, is not the same thing as love, respect, or accountability. It's simply the same underlying need for supply, expressed through channels that are harder to recognize than the obvious chasing we've discussed in earlier episodes. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation: why this specific kind of hidden obsession is actually more dangerous, in certain ways, than the visible kind, why it tends to escalate rather than fade the longer you remain unreachable through direct contact, and what actually happens if you find yourself pulled back in by any of these signals, mistaking them, understandably, for evidence that things could finally be different this time. Let's talk about why this hidden, disguised form of obsession is actually more dangerous, in specific ways, than the loud, visible chasing we've talked about in earlier episodes, because understanding this distinction changes how seriously you take these signs when you notice them. Visible obsession, the kind that shows up as constant texting, obvious pleading, dramatic displays of missing someone, has one significant advantage built into it: it's easy to recognize for what it is, and easy to explain to other people if you need support in resisting it. If someone is texting you 15 times a day, most friends and family will immediately understand why that's concerning, why it needs a boundary, why engaging with it isn't a good idea. Hidden obsession doesn't come with that same clarity, because every individual sign taken in isolation has a plausible, innocent explanation. The entire pattern is far easier to dismiss, minimize, or explain away, not just to other people you might describe it to, but to yourself, in the moments when you're trying to make sense of what you're noticing. This is exactly why hidden obsession tends to be so much more psychologically confusing to live inside than the visible kind. When someone is obviously chasing you, there's very little internal debate about what's happening. When someone is monitoring you quietly, asking about you through mutual friends, engineering proximity while maintaining plausible deniability, performing their thriving life specifically for your benefit, and reviving old conflicts under the guise of practical necessity, each individual behavior can be waved away, one at a time, leaving you in a strange, disorienting position where you sense something is happening, but can't quite point to any single piece of concrete evidence solid enough to convince either yourself or anyone else that it's real. Here's the second reason this hidden pattern is particularly dangerous. It tends to escalate specifically the longer you remain genuinely unreachable, rather than fading the way healthy detachment eventually does on both sides. This connects directly to something we discussed in an earlier episode about what actually happens inside a narcissist's mind when the chasing stops, the mirror going dark, the internal panic that follows. The hidden signs we walked through in the first half of today's episode aren't a stable, steady-state behavior. They tend to intensify over time, precisely because the underlying need driving them isn't being satisfied through any direct, sustainable channel. Someone monitoring your life from a distance doesn't get the same kind of resolution that direct contact would provide, which means the monitoring often has to increase in frequency or intensity just to produce the same diminishing return. The same way any behavior driven by an unmet need tends to escalate rather than settle once the underlying need remains unaddressed. This explains a pattern a lot of people report without quite understanding why it happens. Months of relative quiet, followed by a sudden intensification. More frequent questions through mutual friends. A noticeably more calculated social media presence. An unexpected reappearance in a shared space after a long period of apparent avoidance. This escalation isn't random. It's what happens when a slow-burning, indirect form of obsession finally reaches a point where the indirect channels alone aren't providing enough to satisfy whatever internal need is driving the entire pattern, and something has to intensify in order to compensate. Now let's talk about the third reason this is dangerous, and it's the one that matters most for you personally, because it involves what happens if you find yourself genuinely pulled back in by one of these signals. Here's the trap. And it's worth naming clearly, because these signs are indirect, deniable, and often genuinely confusing. Discovering one of them can feel, in the moment, like meaningful evidence that things could be different this time. Evidence that they never really stopped caring, that the connection was real, that maybe this indicates real growth or real remorse finally surfacing. This interpretation is completely understandable. And it's exactly the interpretation these indirect signals are, whether consciously or not, designed to produce. But here's what actually needs to be understood clearly before any of these signs get reinterpreted as an invitation to reconnect. Monitoring, indirect questioning, engineered proximity, performative displays, and unresolved grievances are not the same thing as genuine accountability, genuine change, or genuine readiness for a healthier relationship. They are, at their core, exactly the same underlying need we've discussed throughout this entire series. The need for supply, for continued relevance in your emotional world, for confirmation that they still matter to you, simply expressed through channels sophisticated enough to avoid the vulnerability and accountability that direct, honest reconnection would actually require. This is the crucial distinction, and I want to walk through it carefully because it's the piece that protects you from mistaking hidden obsession for genuine growth. Genuine change, if it were actually happening, would look completely different from any of the 5 signs we've discussed today. It would involve direct, honest communication rather than indirect monitoring. It would involve accountability for specific past harm rather than performative displays designed to provoke a reaction. It would involve respecting your stated boundaries rather than engineering proximity that technically avoids violating those boundaries while still creating opportunities for contact. And crucially, it would not require you to notice it at all in order for it to be real. Genuine internal change happens regardless of whether you're watching, because it's not actually about you noticing it. It's about them becoming a fundamentally different person in ways that would hold true whether or not you were ever aware of them at all. The 5 signs we discussed today fail every single one of these tests. They require your awareness in order to function. They're calibrated specifically for your reaction. They avoid direct accountability while still creating opportunities for renewed contact. This is exactly why they need to be recognized for what they actually are, a sophisticated continuation of the same underlying dynamic, rather than evidence that something has actually shifted in a healthy direction. I want to say something important about what to actually do if you notice these signs happening, because recognition alone doesn't automatically protect you unless it translates into a specific response. The healthiest response, in almost every case, is to simply continue exactly the path you were already on, without acknowledging the signs directly, without reaching out to address them, without giving any indication that you've noticed the monitoring, the questions, the engineered proximity, or the performative displays at all. This isn't about being cold or vindictive. It's about recognizing that any acknowledgement, even a confrontational one, functions as exactly the kind of engagement this entire pattern is designed to produce. The most protective response to indirect obsession is the same response that protects against direct obsession: continued, genuine disengagement, regardless of how compelling any individual sign might feel in the moment it surfaces. I want to leave you with something important as we close out this entire conversation, because I think it reframes everything we've discussed across both halves of this episode. Recognizing that a narcissist remains obsessed with you in this hidden, disguised way is not actually good news, however tempting it might be to interpret it that way. It's not evidence that you were special enough to be unforgettable, or that the connection was uniquely real, or that some part of them genuinely, deeply cared in a way that validates everything you experienced together. It's simply evidence that their internal system still hasn't found an adequate replacement source of the specific kind of reflection your attention used to provide, and understanding that distinction clearly is what actually protects your own peace, rather than pulling you back into a story that flatters the ego but ultimately keeps you entangled in something that was never actually about love in the first place. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures everything we've walked through today better than any explanation could. Picture a lighthouse standing at the edge of a rocky coast, its light shut off, its keeper gone, the whole structure apparently abandoned, left dark against the night sky the way it's supposed to look once its purpose has genuinely ended. Anyone sailing past, glancing at that dark silhouette against the horizon, would reasonably assume there's nothing left inside it worth noticing. An empty structure, decommissioned, no longer serving any function at all. But look closer, at certain hours, on certain nights, and you'll notice something the darkness doesn't fully hide. A faint shape moving behind one of the upper windows. A brief flicker, quickly extinguished, of a match being struck and blown out again before it can grow into anything visible from a distance. Someone is still inside that lighthouse, still watching the water, still tracking every ship that passes close enough to see, all while maintaining, very carefully, the appearance from the outside that nothing remains there at all. This is not a person who has moved on. This is someone maintaining the appearance of abandonment while still quietly, obsessively, tracking exactly what passes by. Someone who understands that if the light were fully, openly lit again, if the obsession were ever made visible and direct, it would require an honesty about their own ongoing need that they've never been able or willing to provide. And here's what matters most for the ship still sailing past that darkened structure, still occasionally sensing movement behind those windows without ever getting full confirmation of what's actually happening inside. The ship does not need to sail back toward the lighthouse to investigate, does not need to shine its own light toward those windows to force a response, does not need any resolution about what exactly is happening behind that carefully maintained darkness in order to continue safely on its own course. The ship's job was never to illuminate what someone else has chosen to keep hidden. It was simply to notice the rocks that structure was always meant to warn against, take the warning fully to heart, and keep moving steadily toward open water, toward a horizon that doesn't require constant, careful monitoring from anyone standing quietly behind a darkened window, hoping, without ever admitting it, that the ship might still be watching back.